This sounds impossible, but it's real. Felt like someone was quietly watching over you, not to harm, but to protect. Between 1985 and 2000, at least 8 people across America found strange gifts on their porch. Warm stones, wild herbs, bundles of seeds, all marked with the same mysterious symbol. This isn't a legend. It's not horror fiction. The massive footprints, the crude bandages made of moss, the forest paths cleared overnight. All of it was real, carefully documented in journals, survivor accounts, and one silent pact carried across decades. The truth: there is an ancient, intelligent presence in the woods, and it's been watching us. I spent 2 years gathering their stories, from a widowed nurse, a guilt-ridden hunter, to an orphaned boy and a retired librarian, each one whispering the same thing: don't ask more. But if you stay, you'll discover who the forest guardians really are, why they only appear to the lonely, the grieving, the broken, and how they save people without ever speaking a word. Vernon, a 73-year-old recluse, left carrots by a tree and woke up to a bundle of wild seeds. Nora, mourning her lost son, passed out alone and awoke bandaged in moss and fern. Coulter, a haunted veteran, was pulled from a burning mill and found a note. So again. Think it's just a myth? Maybe that's because you've never seen them on your doorstep. Watch till the end, and you'll know why they're still here. So, before we go deeper, where are you watching this from? A quiet town? A cabin near the woods? Maybe just your phone in bed? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to greet you properly. This story connects people in ways you wouldn't expect. Let's see where it finds you. Misty light clung to the Monongahela ridgeline like a breath held too long. At 73, Vernon Pike had long stopped waiting on other people's time. His days began before the sun touched the treetops, and this morning was no different. The cold bite of spring lingered in the boards of the cabin floor as he eased himself out of bed, joints stiff from the frost still clinging to the edge of March. The stove crackled in the corner from the last log he'd thrown in before bed. Outside, the wind hadn't spoken yet. The forest was still holding its tongue. He filled the dented kettle, same one Maureen used when she made her nettle teas, and set it over the fire. A row of jars lined the shelf above. Dried beans, salt, powdered cornmeal. The sort of life you keep going with when you've buried everyone who once shared it. The dog had died years back. His son, somewhere in Utah, never called. And Maureen, well, it had been 10 winters since he'd carved her name into the old white pine on the ridge. He opened the back door with the usual groan of the hinges and stepped into the stillness, basket under arm. The morning air was wet and clean, soaked in pine and the iron smell of thawed soil. He moved with practiced steps down the narrow trail toward the woodshed, boots brushing against last year's brittle leaves. That's when he stopped. The hairs on his arms stood up before his mind caught up. The firewood wasn't right. It should have been stacked horizontal, tidy rows he'd done himself, lined against the back wall. But now it wasn't just moved. It was shaped, angled. 2 staggered stacks of split oak leaned like arrowheads. Clean, deliberate, too neat for the wind, too strange for a kid's, and certainly not the work of a bear. He stared at it for a long while, the silence pressing against his chest like a hand. Then he looked down. The dirt beside the garden was soft from last night's rain, and there, sunk deep into the tilled rows of pole beans, was a footprint, not a man's. Not unless that man wore no boots, had 5 long toes, and a foot as long as his forearm. 18 inches, if he was guessing right. The weight of it sank through 3 inches of soil, heavy enough to bruise the earth. He knelt, ran a finger through the edge of the print. The shape was clear. A ridge across the ball, a deep center where a heel had pressed. His pulse knocked in his ears. Something had walked through his garden. Something big, something barefoot, something careful. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. That night, the wind turned sharp. A low front moved in from the northwest, and clouds pressed down over the hollow like a lid. He tossed 2 extra logs into the stove and buttoned his flannel shirt up to the neck. No TV, no radio. He didn't keep those. Only the tick of the wall clock, the occasional snap of the fire. He sat in his old chair with the quilt across his knees, staring into the flames when he heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing, close, right outside the window. A long, weighty exhale. Thick, damp. Not from the wind. The sort of sound made by lungs that could hold more air than any man. He didn't move, didn't blink. He could feel it. The pressure. Like something was watching, studying, measuring the space between them through glass and shadow. It didn't knock. It didn't growl. Just breathed once more, low and even. And then silence. The next morning, the air was warmer. Birds returned. The frost had melted down to dew. He opened the door expecting only mud and moss and maybe a few raccoon prints. Instead, there on the top step was a flat, wide stone, palm-sized, smooth as a riverbed, still warm to the touch. He lifted it slowly. The heat sank into his skin like something freshly held to flame. But there'd been no fire outside, nothing burned. The warmth was recent, placed with purpose. It hadn't come from nature. It hadn't come from chance. He set it on the windowsill inside, like a question he wasn't ready to ask. That afternoon, he picked a few carrots from the edge of the garden, split a cornbread round left from supper, wrapped them both in a cloth, and walked to the old chestnut stump near the edge of his woods, just before the creek. He laid the cloth down there gentle, not as an offering, but not one, either. He didn't expect anything back. But the next morning, the cloth was gone. In its place, a tight cluster of seeds he didn't recognize. Not from his stock, not from any he'd bought at the feed store. Tiny brown shells, coiled like snails, with a scent of bark and spice. Beside them, etched into the soft soil like a deliberate echo, was the same symbol from the firewood. Not a word, not a sound, just that. Again. He sat long that day by the woodpile, the seeds resting in his palm, the wind pressing soft against his ears. He didn't say anything aloud, but inside he whispered what he hadn't said to another soul in years. I see you. Later, he dug a small plot near the shed, planted the seeds, watered them from the tin can by the barrel, not knowing what would come up, just that something would. Each day after that, he'd leave a little something at the stump, sometimes cornbread, sometimes beans. Once, the carved dog whistle his grandson had left behind a summer long gone. It never came back, but the day after, there was a feather. Long, black, threaded with copper sheen, like it belonged to no crow or hawk he'd ever known. At night, he heard less breathing, more footsteps, not loud, not threatening, but present. A loop around the house, a pause near the window. Sometimes a soft brushing against the boards, like the gentlest tug at memory. He took to sitting up later, not to catch it, not to scare it off, but just to listen. One morning after rain, he stepped outside and saw his axe propped upright beside the door. Clean, sharpened, as if someone had honed it during the night. He reached for the handle. It felt different, warmer, balanced, reverent. That day, he didn't do much but think. By week's end, he stopped doubting. This wasn't chance, wasn't coincidence. The exchange had become a rhythm, a dialogue without words, a pattern stitched through time like thread through an old jacket. Something in those woods was watching, learning, responding. Not beast, not man, but something else. Not wild, not tame. Intelligent, intentional. And it wasn't just coming for food. It was waiting for something more, that night. Vernon Pike stood at the edge of his porch, the lantern behind him casting his shadow long into the trees. He didn't speak, didn't reach for his rifle. He just looked out across the dark, toward the stump, toward the hush that followed each breeze like it carried a secret too big for words. The air smelled of pine and damp bark and something older. He closed the door, slowly, lit one last log for the stove, sat back in the chair Maureen once mended, and waited. Not for answers, but for the next message in a language only the quiet could understand. And in the soft glow of the firelight, just before sleep caught him, he heard it again. Not breathing, not footsteps. 3 low knocks, far off, measured. And then silence, but a silence that knew his name. The wind moved through the Ozarks like a slow breath held in the lungs of something ancient. It wrapped around the edges of the old Sloan farmstead, whispering through the slats in the barn, brushing over the porch swing that hadn't creaked in days. The grass had come back green that summer, but not all the way. Patches of yellow still hung on near the fence line, and the soil stayed soft too long, as if it hadn't made peace with the rain yet. Maribel Sloan stood barefoot at the edge of her raised beds, a dirt-smudged trowel in one hand, her other brushing along the stems of squash that should have been fuller by now. There were nibbles taken out of the zucchini, neat and clean, and she squinted toward the woods beyond the pasture but didn't speak. Something had taken just the ripest ones. Not torn, not trampled, harvested. The kind of loss you couldn't blame on deer or raccoons. She wasn't scared. Not yet. The woods didn't frighten her. They'd raised her. She was born on this land, left it for 10 years, then crawled back to it after the divorce split her down the center. Now it was just her in the house, the ghosts of her parents in every door hinge and floorboard, and the small ache that never left her belly, the one the doctor said would fade, but hadn't, the one that came after she'd lost the baby and hadn't quite found herself again. She straightened up, wiping her palm on the side of her skirt, and glanced toward the barn. The light was turning late, gold brushing through the clouds, a wind curling from the east. The rooster hadn't crowed since May, and though she never said it out loud, some part of her missed the sound. It made the place feel watched over. The next morning she found it on the porch, a basket, woven from wild vines, tight and careful, with no break in the weave. Inside were dark berries, fat and glistening. Not the kind you picked easily. Not the ones that grew in clumps by the road. These came from higher up, deeper in the forest, where the ground grew moss-thick like velvet. Nestled beside the berries were folded fronds of clean moss, laid soft and flat like bedding. She looked around, heart picking up a little beat. No footprints, no scuff in the dirt, no tire tracks. Just the basket, just the offering. She brought it inside and sat it gently on the table, then lit the old oil lamp though it was still morning, just to study it better. The berries weren't bruised. The moss was fresh. Her breath slowed as she leaned forward, fingers trembling slightly. It was careful, whatever did this. Deliberate. That night, the rain came hard. Fast wind. Lightning so close it rattled the dishes in the cabinets. Thunder like an old god's voice coming from the ridge. She shut the shutters and laid towels under the window frame that always leaked. But the dogwood outside bent too far in the gusts. She stood by the back door, holding the edge of her jacket close, watching the dark with narrowed eyes. Something was out there, not in the storm, in the stillness between the cracks. That quiet, right before another gust rolled through. Then she saw it, a shape, bigger than any man, half hidden in the curtain of rain, not charging, not looming, just standing. Then it moved, closer, not fast, but direct, a few steps toward the porch, and she felt the pull of it like gravity. Before she could turn away, it lifted a hand, long and wide, and ever so gently, tugged at the edge of her coat sleeve. Just a touch. A guidance. She froze, didn't scream, didn't move. The hand lowered. Then the figure turned and walked toward the tree line, not looking back, but not hurrying. She hesitated only a second before stepping off the porch and following, the mud thick under her boots, the rain running into her collar. It wasn't a trail, not one she knew, but the path was cut clean through brambles and thorns, as if something massive had passed through, slicing it open like a secret passage meant only for her. They never spoke. It never turned around. But she followed the shadow until it faded into trees and fog, and suddenly she stood alone on a slope above the ravine. Below, she saw it. The glint of iron. A hunting trap, broken open, bent wide like it had been pried apart by bare hands stronger than any machine. Blood in the leaves. Fresh. She turned back toward the house. Lightning flashed once more across the sky, but the path behind her was gone. No more cut brush, just forest. As if it had closed behind her, sealing away the moment. She reached her porch soaked, shaking, looked over her shoulder again. Nothing but rain and trees and the smell of moss. The next day, the sun came hard and dry, curling the edges of yesterday's storm. Her fingers ached. Her jaw was tight from how she'd clenched it all night, and she barely slept. She stepped outside to tend the hens and saw the mark. Black soot, charcoal maybe, drawn on the wooden door of the chicken coop in 2 neat arrows. Not letters, not a symbol she knew, but it meant something. She felt it in her gut. It wasn't graffiti, it wasn't a prank. It was a warning, a sign. And suddenly she remembered the trap, the blood, the presence that led her there. Not to hurt her, to protect her, to steer her away. That hand hadn't grabbed. It had pulled her clear. Just enough, just in time. She sat down on the porch, her hands shaking as she reached into the basket that still sat there, now dry from the night. She picked one of the remaining berries and rolled it in her palm before pressing it gently between her teeth. Sweet, wild, honest. That night she heard voices, not the thing from the woods, but men. One of them her ex-husband, the other a friend of his, Clyde something, who always smelled like grease and cheap beer. They were laughing low, crunching over gravel just outside the gate. She ducked behind the curtain and watched from the dark. "We saw the marks, Mari," the ex called out, voice slurred. "You been drawing weird stuff? Thinking you're some kind of forest witch now?" Clyde chuckled and spat into the grass. "Bet she's just gone stir-crazy up here alone." She didn't answer, didn't open the door, just watched as they poked around the barn, then walked the fence line, looking for something, or someone. She couldn't shake the feeling they weren't just drunk. They were hunting. She waited till they were gone. Hours, maybe longer. Then she stepped outside in the moonlight and walked to the edge of the pasture. The trees stood tall, silent sentinels in the dark. She didn't say anything, just left a mason jar with honey by the stump where the brambles didn't grow. Turned around and walked back without looking behind her. At sunrise, the jar was gone. In its place, a pine cone wrapped tight in woven reed. Inside it, she found tiny stones, polished, warm, arranged in a pattern that made no sense to her mind, but settled into something quiet inside her chest. Days passed. No more stolen vegetables. Instead, she found neat piles of gathered mushrooms on the back step. A tuft of fox fur hung from a nail on the barn, braided into a loop like a charm. And always, that shape. Marked somewhere close, in ash, in berry juice, in scratched bark. She never saw it again in daylight, but sometimes, at night, she felt it. That presence, not watching, just near. A breath held close. A shadow at the edge of knowing, and though she couldn't say what it was, or why it chose her, she knew this. Whatever lived out there had hands that healed, eyes that watched, and rules older than the hills. And somewhere between the storms and the silence, it had decided she was worth guiding. But guidance, she'd soon learn, wasn't the same as safety. And the woods, even when they gave, could still take something back. The fog in Cascade had a way of swallowing things whole. Trees, fences, even voices. It hung low in the morning like a memory the earth wasn't ready to forget. Dylan Rook sat cross-legged on the splintering porch of his grandparents' house, a dull pencil in one hand, a soft wood shingle in the other, pressing lines where no one told him to draw. 11 years old, but quieter than most boys that age. Dylan didn't talk much anymore, not since the accident. Not since the fire that took the Buick and both his parents one winter night in Portland, leaving behind a half-melted harmonica and the boy who used to play it. Now it was just him and his grandparents in the woods of western Oregon, tucked deep in a timber pocket where the road stopped pretending to be paved. Their house leaned like it had been holding its breath for too long. His grandpa still split wood every morning with a cough that shook the axe handle, and his grandma moved slow, like someone chasing a memory that never turned around. They loved him, but love didn't always reach the places grief sank its teeth into. He drew what he couldn't say. Not cartoons, not real people either. Things with fur, long arms, eyes too wide, figures standing behind trees. Shadows shaped like people but taller, with shoulders that sloped down like branches in heavy snow. Most of his sketches never showed faces, just the space where a face might be, filled with charcoal smears and something else he couldn't name. It started on a Thursday after the rain. He'd been walking the trail behind the chicken wire fence, just past where the creek ran crooked through the gully, looking for deer tracks or anything worth pretending was an adventure. That's when he saw it. Tucked between two cedars, half concealed by brush, stood a structure that wasn't supposed to be there. A shelter, if you could call it that. Built low to the ground, woven from branches and pine bark. Its roof pressed down like the whole forest had agreed to keep it secret. Dylan stepped closer, the mud sucking softly at his boots. There was no door, just a lean-in opening, shaded by fresh-cut boughs. Inside, the air was warm in a strange way, like breath. Not rot, not damp, just warm. He crouched low and peeked in. There were things laid out with care. A small pile of smooth river stones, a bundle of moss tied with vine, a thick brown hair, longer than any bear's he'd seen in his books, curled around a flat stone, and next to it, carved into a plank of bark-stripped wood, the same shape he'd scratched once before without knowing why. 2 arrowheads pointing forward. He didn't touch anything, just looked, then backed out like the woods were watching him breathe. That evening, he didn't tell his grandparents. Not out of fear, more out of instinct. Like the kind you have when you find something living under a fallen log and you know not to lift it again. He stayed quiet at dinner, ate slowly, and went to bed early. The wind rattled the screen door just before midnight, but he didn't check it. The power went out the next night. No storm, no wind. Just a slow dimming, like the whole house had sighed and gone to sleep. His grandma lit candles, and his grandpa grumbled about the transformer down near the ranger station. Dylan sat by the window, legs pulled to his chest, watching the dark creep between the trees. The cold came fast. No furnace hum, just still air and the slow creep of chill through the walls. It was near 2 a.m. when he heard it. A soft tap at the window. Not sharp, not a knock. More like a padded hand checking if he was still there. He didn't move, but his eyes found it, right there on the sill. A stone, flat, wide, still faintly steaming. He opened the window slowly. The outside air cut like river water, sharp and metallic. The stone was warm. Warm like a pocket, like skin. Beside it, tucked in the gap where the frame didn't quite seal, was a fan of dry bracken fern, curled at the tips. The scent hit him hard. Earthy, almost sweet, like sap and loam. He held the fern close to his face, then turned toward the bedroom down the hall. His grandfather was breathing ragged, caught in the grip of something tight in his lungs. The cold didn't help. He always got this way when the temperature dropped, especially since last winter's bronchitis. Grandma was asleep in her chair, a book face down on her lap. Dylan didn't think, he just moved. He filled the kettle, lit a match with shaking fingers, and set the stone beside the stove to help warm the room. He folded the fern carefully, tucked it beneath a wool cloth, and rested it on the old man's chest like a gesture more than a remedy. And by dawn, the breathing had eased. He didn't draw that day, just sat in the corner of the porch, watching the tree line like it might breathe back. And it did, quietly, patiently, with presence more than noise. That afternoon, he returned to the shelter. This time, he brought something. A broken-off piece of graphite pencil wrapped in twine, and one of his drawings. Charcoal on soft birch paper. It showed a large hand, fingers too long, palm too wide. Open, not clenched. The kind of hand that placed stones, not through them. He left it just inside the doorway, then turned and walked home, trying not to look over his shoulder. The next morning, the drawing was still there, but not the same. The hand remained. But beside it, drawn in slow, dark strokes, were eyes. Not perfect circles, not childlike doodles, but deep ovals, sunken and solemn. A stare that wasn't hostile, just real. Like it had been looking at him, and now it wanted him to know that. He folded the paper tight, tucked it under his shirt, and didn't show anyone. A few days later, a ranger came by. Knocked on the screen door, boots muddy, radio clipped to his belt. Said something about a complaint from hikers. Said folks had seen someone living in the woods, tall, quiet. Looked like a drifter. He asked Dylan if he'd seen anything unusual out near the ridgeline. The boy said no. Said the woods were quiet, just deer and birds. The ranger left without pushing. That night, Dylan stayed up late again. Not scared, just waiting. He didn't hear the steps, but the window cooled faster than usual. And when he touched the sill, there was another stone. This one wrapped in a curled birch leaf, tied with grass. Inside, folded with perfect care, was a strip of soft bark, marked again with that silent signature. It didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a beginning, and as he lay down, the drawing pressed close against his chest. He whispered into the dark the first words he'd spoken to anyone outside his family in weeks. I saw you too. And somewhere in the distance, the trees leaned just enough to let the stars through, and the earth stayed warm for one more night. Under the crushing quiet of a Montana winter, the mountains wore silence like a shroud. Bitterroot never did wake easy in January. The wind didn't just whistle. It moaned, long and hollow through the ravines, like something old was calling out from the stone. Snow pressed in on the roof of the hayfield cabin, creaked in the joints of the wood, curled in the corners of the windows. Nora Hayfield hadn't opened her front door in 2 days. Not since the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the creek in one long exhale. Inside, the only sound was the slow tick of the kitchen clock and the occasional shuffle of firewood as it cracked in the stove. She moved slow these days. The stiffness in her hips was a quiet reminder of time she didn't ask for. Her fingers trembled just enough that it made threading a needle damn near impossible. She still tried, though. Knitting kept her from thinking too hard, but not hard enough. Because some memories don't die. They just wait until it's quiet enough to whisper again, like the one of her son, 18 years old, smiling under coal dust just hours before the mine gave way, and buried half his crew under 2 tons of wet rock. They said it was fast. She never believed them. Not really. That afternoon, while gathering kindling near the slope behind the woodshed, her boot caught a patch of ice. Her leg slid. Her shoulder slammed the frozen earth. But it was the back of her head that took the worst of it. The sky above tilted. her breath fogged in short bursts. Then, blackness. When she came to, the light had changed. A strange warmth prickled along her cheek like someone had lit a fire near her. The smell hit her first, clean, like cedar and crushed mint. She blinked up at a blur of snow-flecked gray and saw that her coat had been opened, a bundle of something soft tucked against her chest. Ribbons of pale moss, lined with layers of leaves crushed into green paste, were wrapped around her scalp. Someone had packed the back of her head with a poultice. Her vision blurred again, but before she lost it, she caught a sound. Not the wind, not the forest. Breathing, slow, grounded, heavy enough that it seemed to bend the cold. She didn't move. Couldn't. But her eyes followed the shape crouched a few feet away. Massive shoulders, dark fur twitching slightly with each rise and fall of breath. It didn't look at her, just watched the tree line, listening, guarding. Then, just as silently, it slipped behind a drift and was gone. When she staggered back inside an hour later, her cheeks numb and her legs trembling, the fire had already been stoked. The stove roared low and steady, and beside the hearth, resting like a gift, was a wide stone still radiating heat. She didn't question how it got there. Not out loud. Her hands went to the bandage around her head, still damp with something that smelled like wild sage. The next morning, the snow had lightened, and Nora dared to step farther down the slope, following the faint trail of what had been left behind. The prints were wide, deeper than any boot would sink. 5 toes, human-like but broader, spaced with a stride longer than hers by half. They led to a hollow where the underbrush had been flattened like something large had knelt. Beside it, a smaller path, lighter, narrower, marked a second set of tracks. Not a cub, but not yet grown. She found it by accident, the juvenile. It was tucked under a fallen pine, a branch snapped clean through and pinned across its lower leg. It didn't snarl, didn't flinch, just stared at her through eyes the color of wet bark. One arm clutched its side, the other trembled with shallow breath. Its face was different. The bone structure sharp, but the expression? It was pain and patience. She should have run. Everything in her said so. But her knees lowered before her brain caught up. Its leg was swollen, punctured. She recognized the purple throb of poison from wild thistle briars, the kind that grew along creek beds. Its fur was matted with sap and dried mud, but the wound was clean. Someone, something, had tried to treat it. She whispered without knowing why. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But its chest rose slower. She pulled off her glove, fingers shaking not from cold, but from awe, and gently peeled back the moss-packed leaves. The thorn was still in there. Long, dark, deep. She dug into her coat pocket and pulled out her old field knife. The edge was dull, but the tip still had purpose. Her hands moved with the certainty that comes when you have no time to doubt. She worked slowly, steady. The thorn slid free in one long motion, followed by a drop of dark blood thick as syrup. The creature exhaled hard, like it had been holding its breath for hours. She used the sleeve of her jacket to dab it clean, then wrapped it with the few strips of dry cloth she had in her pocket. It didn't pull away, not once. Behind her a tree groaned in the wind, and then she felt it. Another presence. The hair at the back of her neck lifted. She didn't turn right away. But she saw the shadow, tall, towering, just beyond the tree line. Watching, she didn't move. Just finished the bandage and whispered, "There, that's better." Only then did she rise. Slowly, no sudden movement. The large one remained half hidden behind a tree, its face unreadable. But its posture had changed, no longer guarded. Still tense, but different. The kind of tension you feel when deciding whether to speak or stay silent forever. She nodded once, then walked away. That night, the snow returned. Thick, sideways sheets of it. Wind screamed through the gaps in the roof like it was searching for someone. Sometime around midnight, the glow of headlights swept across the wall. Nora peeked through the curtain and saw a truck. County insignia. 2 men in thick coats. One had a clipboard. The other carried a rifle slung loose across his chest. They knocked. She didn't answer. They left after a few minutes, boot prints crunching in the white. In the silence that followed, she noticed it again. A presence just beyond the back door. No knock, no sound. But she felt it. The quiet weight of something immense, pressing gently on the boundary of her home. Then, from the outside, a sound. A single heavy hand pressed flat against the wooden frame of the door. She didn't open it, just stood there, breathing, heart loud. No words passed between them. But it was enough. The next morning, a strip of bark hung from the eave above her porch. Woven into it with vines and thin roots was a small pouch. Inside were leaves she didn't recognize, dried petals, and shavings of something that smelled like pine and citrus. Wrapped around it all was a cord of tightly braided fibers from tree bark. It looked like a sling for carrying small herbs, or medicine. On its surface, in charcoal, marked once again, Beyond. She pressed her hand to her heart. Not as thanks, as promise. She made tea with the leaves that night, the kind that let her sleep without the dreams. No collapsed tunnels, no screaming names through rock, just quiet. And snow. And somewhere in the forest, between the old trees and the shifting mist, something watched the smoke rise from her chimney and knew she had chosen not to tell. Not the county, not the rangers. The secret was hers now, and the next time they came, whoever they were, she would not let them take it. The Adirondack air carried the weight of something scorched. Spring had come late in '93, clawing its way out from under the last frost, but up on the ridge, the trees still looked hollowed, stripped bare where they shouldn't be. What once held thick hemlock and fir was now cracked earth, heavy machinery, and silence that didn't belong. Coulter Ames stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed over a denim jacket faded by years and weather. His eyes scanned the slope above the stream, where the company flags still fluttered, even though the crews had gone quiet for the weekend. He hadn't signed up for this kind of job. Not exactly. The security gig had seemed simple. Night shifts, watch the perimeter, keep nosy hikers out. Don't ask too many questions. But the first night he saw the herds vanish, he knew the forest had already spoken louder than any paycheck. Coulter had been a soldier once. Not the kind that told war stories at bars or collected medals. The quiet kind. The kind that left pieces behind in places too dry to remember. Iraq. Kuwait. Names he didn't say out loud. Since he came back, noise never really left his head. But up here, at least it had rhythm. Cicadas. Water moving through stones, pine bending under wind. Until the loggers came, the machinery worked fast. Stripped the ridge down in less than 2 weeks. The creek below had gone from clear to rust brown. Rocks sloshed with foam where trout used to dart. It wasn't just the trees that looked wrong. The birds were quieter. The elk didn't come down from the high trail anymore. That's when he first saw the figure. Tall, still, just inside the tree line. It didn't run, didn't shout, just stood like it had always been there. Watching. He didn't call it in, didn't mention it in the logbook, because something in his chest, something deeper than fear, told him not to. He'd grown up on stories, like most boys around here, of wild men in the woods, of watchers and giants and things that knew how to vanish between tree trunks without snapping a single twig. He hadn't believed them. Not until the ridge changed. He started noticing patterns. Small ones. Arranged stones near the water's edge. Logs crossed in deliberate angles. Symbols scratched onto exposed bark with sap still fresh. Then came the dry storm. It was late. Nearly 1 a.m. The air felt charged. Heavy with pressure. No rain. Just wind and the kind of silence that makes your spine itch. He'd just made his rounds when the sky split open with a fork of lightning that hit the ridge behind the equipment trailer. The flash lit up the whole clearing, and what it revealed stayed burned behind his eyes. Bright Step. That's what he'd call the creature later, when memory needed a name. It was smaller than the first one he'd seen. Younger, leaner, but real. More than just a shadow. Its fur was matted from the heat, its arms singed. It looked dazed, blinking against the brightness, mouth slightly open like it was trying to understand what just happened. And then it looked at him, not past him, not through him, at him. Right then, a stack of processed timber caught fire from another strike. The blaze snapped up like it had been waiting for an excuse. And in that moment of chaos, Coulter saw something else. Grove deep, towering, massive. Moving fast for something its size, grabbing the smaller one by the shoulder and shoving it back toward the trees. But Bright Step stumbled. A beam rolled free and dropped. Coulter didn't think. He sprinted. Axe still on his hip. Reached them in seconds he still doesn't remember. He grabbed Bright Step by the arm, its skin hot, breath ragged, and yanked hard, the beam crashing inches behind them. The creature let out a noise, low and startled, half animal, half something older. Smoke thickened fast. The fire moved like it knew where to go. He turned, dragging the gas canisters from the base of the trailer and flinging them down the slope into the mud. They hissed but didn't blow. He backed up coughing, hands burnt, sweat stinging his eyes. And when he looked again, they were gone. Just shadows between flame and tree. He fell asleep that morning on his porch, flannel shirt wrapped tight around his bandaged hand. The burn wasn't bad, but it throbbed. By noon the company called, said the fire had damaged too much. They were pulling the plug, contract canceled, cleanup crews would come next week. He didn't care. He walked to the edge of the clearing, boots crunching ash, and found it there, on the step of the old ranger outpost. A pouch, woven from vine and bark. Inside, seeds, dark brown, glossy. Some smooth, some ridged like tree rings. Wrapped in a thin strip of cured hide was a message. Not words, not letters, just the symbol again. Ah. And beneath it, drawn with the burnt tip of a branch, a simple line. Under it, a second rising, then a third. It looked like a hill, or maybe a forest regrown. Coulter held the seeds for a long time, then looked back at the slope. The earth was black, but it was still breathing. And maybe, just maybe, it could be healed. He didn't go back to the company, didn't ask for another job. Instead, he cleared a small plot near the cabin, dug deep into the ash, planted every single seed with bare fingers. The rain came 3 days later, soaked the soil, and somewhere in the tree line, not far, he swore he saw them again, watching. But this time, not measuring, not testing, just waiting to see if he'd keep his word. He never tore down the sign, never painted over the symbol. And long after the last log was hauled off, long after the last machine stuttered away down the muddy road, the mark remained on the old stump out back. And so did the sound of something tall and breathing just beyond the last tree, where the forest began again. The air in the Smokies held on to sound like secrets in a chapel. It caught the rustle of leaves, the low hum of wind threading through laurel thickets, the faint groan of old branches leaning in the heat. Hannah Bristow stood by the edge of her porch, one hand on the railing, the other clutching a chipped mug gone cold hours ago. She hadn't moved since sunrise. 65, widowed 9 years, still wearing her hair in a tight bun, the way she did when she was a nurse in Memphis during the war. Some habits stayed, even when the people they were tied to didn't. Her cabin leaned into a slope on the Tennessee side of the mountains, tucked far enough from town that silence became company. She didn't mind. Solitude had long since stopped feeling like a wound. It had become something she carried, like the memory of her husband's last breath, one she'd failed to catch, one she'd relived in quiet every night since. It had been 3 days since she heard the scream. Not human, not bear. Something deeper, more guttural. She hadn't told anyone. Who would she tell? The park rangers? The mailman who only came Thursdays? Most days she didn't talk to anyone but the crows that lined her clothesline in the morning. That afternoon she went to gather water from the spring-fed barrel beside the shed. She moved slowly now, legs stiff from an old knee injury. That's when she saw them. 3 deer. Not running, not grazing, just standing in a half moon under the shade of a hickory tree, breathing shallow, eyes wide, ears locked toward the ravine. Their bodies held still like they were listening for something the forest hadn't decided to say yet. She followed their gaze. Downhill, where the fern growth grew thick and the tree trunks were tight, something shifted. Brush bent, but didn't break. A ripple of movement. Slow. Heavy. Then gone. She didn't move, just waited. The deer blinked first, as if whatever had been there had passed through them without harm. They turned and slipped away, hooves soundless on damp leaves. That night, just past midnight, she stepped out onto the back steps to check the latch on the chicken coop. The moon lit the clearing silver. Fog clung low, no wind to move it. That's when she heard the sound again. Different this time, close, intentional. Not a cry, not a threat. Work! Something was happening just beyond the trees. She crept barefoot across the yard, the dirt still warm from the day. She moved quiet as she could, ducked low behind the brush near the shed, heart ticking in her throat. And through the hush, lit only by the broken moonlight sliding through branches, she saw it. A buck, flat on its side, leg bent wrong, chest heaving, panic swimming wild in its eyes. Beside it, 2 figures, tall, too tall, furred in dark layers that caught the moon like wet bark. They didn't speak. They didn't use tools, but they moved with purpose. One knelt by the deer's front legs, long fingers pressed to the shoulder. The other unwrapped something from a pouch, leaves, soft moss, a warmed stone still giving off thin steam. The one crouched low pressed the stone against the deer's ribs, then adjusted its hind leg with surprising care, guiding the twisted joint back into place with a motion so swift and practiced, Hannah almost cried out. The buck screamed once, then went still. She covered her mouth. The figures didn't look up. One pressed its palm flat to the deer's chest. The other laid fern across the wound, then tapped 3 fingers once, firm and even. And the deer, trembling still, rose. Slowly, shakily. It stood, swayed, then bolted. The clearing emptied, all but her. She stepped backward, not looking away, until the porch light finally broke the dark behind her. She didn't sleep. The next day brought heat, the kind that stuck to your bones and made the world feel too still. Hannah stayed inside, curtains drawn, mind restless. She kept replaying what she saw, not out of fear, out of awe, like a song stuck in your throat. By dusk, she walked the path behind the barn to gather herbs from her drying shed. That's when she saw the blood. Not a lot, just enough to mark a trail. Fresh, bright against the moss. Drops leading downhill. And beside them, a broken branch. Cracked at the joint, clean through, bent like something had fallen or crawled past with weight it couldn't carry. She didn't hesitate. She'd carried stretchers in worse places. Held hands while lungs rattled and pulses vanished. This was no different. She followed the trail. The earth grew quiet again. Trees leaned overhead, light falling thin and gold. The blood turned to smears. Then nothing. But there was something else. A smell. Faint, warm, like pressed cedar and riverbank stone. And then the hair on her arms lifted. She turned fast. 2 men. Camouflage jackets. Rifles, packs, standing not 20 yards away near the creek. Heads turned in her direction. "Ma'am," one said, nodding with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You see anything strange out here lately?" The other smirked. Younger, the kind who liked to shoot first and tell lies later. "Just following a trail," she said, voice even. "Something's hurt." They looked at each other. "Mind if we take a look?" the older one asked. "I mind," she answered. He laughed. That's a nice way of saying no, the younger muttered. She didn't move. Conservation project, she lied. Tagged some fawns up near the ridge. You're walking through data zones. Since when does tagging need armed patrol? He asked, motioning to her side, where nothing rested but a pouch of dried herbs. She narrowed her eyes. Since people started shooting before asking questions. There was a sound then. Low, long, not close, but deep, a vibration in the chest more than the ears. The men froze. Oh, what the hell was that? The younger said. Wind, Hannah answered. The brush behind them moved, slow, and they ran. Didn't speak, didn't look back, just stumbled through the creek, splashing like children chased by something too big to name. She waited, let the silence settle again, and when it did, she turned back toward home. That night, just past 3 a.m, she found something on her porch. A bundle, wrapped in bark, bound with grass. Inside, dried leaves she didn't recognize, pressed tight with wildflower petals and tiny polished stones. The scent drifted up before she even unwrapped it fully. A kind of calm, like spring air right after a storm. She brought it inside, set it by the bed, and for the first time in years, she slept without seeing her husband's pale face gasping in the ER hallway. The next morning, the bundle still sat on the table, humming faint warmth. She didn't touch it again, just sat with it, and understood. What she hadn't been able to save back then, she was saving now. Not through needles or stitches, but by standing still and not betraying trust. Not every war needed soldiers. Some just needed witnesses who didn't flinch. She looked out the window toward the tree line. Somewhere in the hush, a branch bent gently, then righted itself, and that was enough. Under the weight of October's sky, the Ozark Plateau held its breath. Trees smoldered in rust and ember hues, hills folded like old flannel, and the air smelled of dry grass, tobacco smoke, and something that had been disturbed. Lyle Corbin hadn't slept right in days. Each night he'd lie on that creaking cot in his one-room shack, jaw clenched, shirt sticking to his chest, waiting for the dreams to come. Dreams where a mother bear's eyes stared back at him from behind his rifle scope. Not wild, not angry, just confused. Then came the sound of the shot. Then silence. That silence was what haunted him. He hadn't fired since. He lived off-grid now, close enough to hear chainsaws echoing down in the new logging tract, but far enough to pretend the world forgot him, which, mostly, it had. Folks in the town of Jasper still muttered his name under their breath, mostly with a curl of the lip or a shake of the head. A hunter who killed a sow nursing 2 cubs, by mistake or not, didn't get forgiveness fast, and Lyle hadn't asked for it. He just kept walking farther into the woods. It was that kind of fall, the kind where wind rattled the bones of trees and every dry leaf sounded like a warning. That morning he'd gone to check the old ridge trail and saw the first sign. Not a scratch, not a footprint, just a mark. 2 arrows, side by side, carved clean into a downed sycamore with blackened soot pressed deep. No, it hadn't been there yesterday. The trail past it led nowhere useful, just up toward the high valley, where the company was set to send machines come Monday. He stood still a long time, feeling the wind press soft against the back of his neck, then kept walking. He wasn't ready to understand what it meant. Not yet. Later that night, long after the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the crickets gave way to the long, low hush of owl wings, fire sparked in the distance. Not his, not natural. Orange light crept through the canopy like it didn't belong. Lyle stepped out of the shack, shotgun in hand, not out of habit, but instinct. He smelled it before he saw it. Gasoline, smoke, burning bark. He moved toward the glow with the urgency of someone remembering too late what dry grass and negligence could cost. Down by the lower tract, a trail of flame licked up the side of the hill. The wind had shifted. Not away from him, toward. Then he saw them. Fern Quiet, the female, just at the edge of the fire line. Tall, wide-shouldered, her fur bristling in the light like iron in a forge. She held something in her arms. Someone, a child, not hers. A human girl, maybe 6 or 7, barefoot, hair clinging to her face with sweat, clutched tight against the massive chest of the creature like something fragile, precious. Fern Quiet didn't hesitate. She moved fast, head low, body bent to shield the girl from embers as she stepped out of the heat and onto the clearing. Lyle's breath caught. A shadow moved behind her, larger, slower, grove deep. That impossible weight, the quiet thunder of his stride. His fur shimmered with ash, and in his arms, dragging heavy and limp, was Bright Step, the younger one, hurt. One leg twisted at the knee. Smoke rolled off him like steam. They reached the edge of the woods and stopped. Lyle didn't move. Fern Quiet lowered the girl to the ground gently, then backed away, her eyes never leaving his. Grove Deep stepped forward. His breath wheezed out like it carried gravel. His arm extended. He pushed the girl lightly toward Lyle, and then turned back without waiting for thanks. But Bright Step didn't follow. His leg gave. He crumpled. A fallen tree blocked the way out, flames already reaching for the canopy above it. Grove Deep moved to lift him again, but something shifted in the wind. Lyle heard it, knew it instinctively. If they waited another 30 seconds, the blaze would cut off the route completely. Lyle ran. No thought, no prayer, just feet pounding dirt, lungs scraping air. He leapt the tree, ignored the heat on his face, dropped beside Bright Step and grabbed under the arm. The skin there was like old rope, tough, hot, heavy. He pulled. Bright Step groaned once, but didn't resist. Behind him, Grove Deep stepped aside, not helping, not stopping. This was Lyle's burden now. Together they dragged the injured one through the last of the flame. The sleeve of Lyle's flannel caught a spark, and he slapped it out with his palm. His forearm blistered quick and angry, but he didn't stop. He got Bright Step to the far edge, rolled him into the moss, and backed away gasping. The world swam. Trees bent, vision narrowed. When he looked up again, they were gone. Only the little girl remained, standing at the edge of his clearing, barefoot, eyes wide. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just reached for his hand. He led her to the shack, wrapped her in a wool blanket, and poured the last of his rain barrel water over her feet. He sat with her in silence as the fire passed. By morning, the authorities had shown, talked about a lucky rescue, asked no questions about the prints. The girl couldn't say how she got there, said she followed a voice through the woods. They called it confusion, said she'd wandered. No one believed her. But Lyle did. He didn't speak of Grove Deep, or Bright Step, or Fern Quiet, not even when they found the logging equipment stripped clean, wires coiled, fuel tanks emptied, tires slashed, but not with blades. On the dash of the main bulldozer, someone had left a smudge of charcoal. By sundown, the company pulled out. Too much risk, they said. Too much strange. Lyle sat on his porch with a bandaged arm and a new scar where his guilt used to be. And that night, in the hush between wind gusts, something moved through the trees. Slow, steady, watching, but not judging, just remembering. Rain fell over the Trinity Alps like a hush pressed onto the land. It was the kind of rain that soaked slowly, crept into wood grain, softened the edge of every sound. Mist clung low to the pine slopes, and fog stretched across the ridgelines like tired breath. The wind didn't speak that morning. It only listened. And Pearl Winslow, 71 years old, folded her coat tighter at the collar as she stepped onto the porch of the little house she'd lived in for nearly 3 decades. The house smelled of cedar and paper and old ink, and on mornings like this, when her knees ached and the valley held its silence just a second too long, it also smelled faintly of memory. She wasn't like the others. She hadn't been a ranger or a hunter or a healer. She'd been a librarian, not in a city, not with computers or big marble desks, but in a cabin no bigger than a single wide, nestled beside the Trinity River, where fly fishermen came and went, and tourists stopped just long enough to ask directions they didn't really need. She kept stories, tended books like other people tended gardens, and she wrote in journals, daily, in tidy block script that barely shook, even now. That morning she found it on the window ledge. Not a letter, not exactly. A shallow wooden bowl, hand-carved, burnished smooth. Inside, seeds. Small ones. Round, ribbed, some red, some black as coal. And beside them, a smooth river stone etched with two familiar marks. Oh, she didn't gasp, didn't panic. She simply stood there, eyes wet but not from rain, and whispered, "I was wondering when you'd find me." She took the bowl inside, set it next to the fire, and sat down in her worn chair, the one with the stuffing coming loose at the arms. Then she opened her journal and began to write. She wrote of Vernon Pike, the miner from West Virginia who'd been the first to describe the sign, who'd left offerings and received warmth. She wrote of Maribel Sloan in Missouri, who followed the creature's lead through a rainstorm and found more than safety waiting for her. She wrote of Dylan Rook, the boy who drew the hand before he ever saw it, of Nora Hayfield, who nursed a wound she didn't cause, of Coulter Ames and the fire he walked through, of Hannah Bristow and the way she stood between violence and grace. She had never met them, not really, but the stories had found her anyway, each one shared in bits and pieces, old postcards, word of mouth, a phone call that dropped just as it got interesting, or a face she hadn't seen in 40 years showing up on her porch with shaking hands and a look that said, "I can't say it, but I need you to understand." And every one of them ended the same. "Don't ask questions, just listen." So she listened, and she wrote. She called them forest keepers, though they'd never told her their name. She gave them that because it felt right, because it wasn't about ownership. It was about care, and it wasn't just one. It was a network, a system that spanned coasts and valleys and mountain spines, quiet, patient, ancient. They weren't watching us. They were watching over. And the more she wrote, the more the picture formed. 15 years, from the Monongahela to the Cascades, each encounter different, each person marked by grief or shame or loss. And in each case, the keepers had not saved them. They had offered something harder, a second chance, the kind you had to choose. That night, the rain sharpened. Wind rose like a song cut in half. And somewhere between candlelight and sleep, Pearl stepped out to close the shutters. She saw him then, not close, not threatening, just standing at the edge of the clearing, grove deep, larger than she had imagined. But still, composed. His shoulders hunched slightly under the weight of the storm. Rain slicked his fur, matted across the chest, steam curling off his arms like breath made visible. He didn't gesture, didn't move. He only looked at her, long enough for her to know. He knew who she was, and that she understood. She raised one hand, no words, and he was gone. Back into the tree line, swallowed by shadow and fog. She didn't sleep. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote a single line on the last page. "We are not alone. We are only asked to act like we belong here." When dawn broke, the rain slowed. A breeze moved through the yard, clearing away the mist like a curtain lifted on the final scene. She stepped outside. The grass was soaked, the stone path slick. But something had changed. The path behind her house, the old deer trail that vanished into brush, was cleared. Not just trampled, cleared, neatly, with purpose. A new path, winding soft into the trees. She walked to its edge. Kneeling in the damp soil, she traced a faint print. Large, deep, but not fresh. Not a warning. A farewell. Beside it, pressed into the moss like a seal on wax, was the symbol. Faded. She stood a long while, not crying, just listening to the silence. Then turned back toward her home, where a pot of coffee waited, and a journal was still open. Later that day, she wrote letters, not confessions, not stories. Instructions. to be sent in time if needed. Not everyone is ready to see what lives in the trees, but someone will be. Someone always is. And long after she was gone, the books on her shelf would remain. The stone on her windowsill would stay warm, and the seeds would be planted. Sometimes the quietest truths live in the deepest parts of the forest, between the trees that still remember, beneath the moss that grows over old wounds, beside the streams that carry more than water. And every now and then, when we slow down long enough to listen, the world shows us that not everything wild is meant to be feared, and not everything human is meant to be followed. There are stories buried in the dirt, woven into the wind, passed silently from creature to creature, heart to heart. Stories about connection, not just with each other, but with the unseen forces that walk beside us in stillness. Some of us call them myths, others feel them in their bones, but perhaps they are neither. Perhaps they are reminders that trust is not built through words, but through quiet offerings, shared silences, and the choices we make when no one else is watching. That kindness, even when it costs us something, even when it's offered to the unknown, still matters. That healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as standing still beside someone who has been running for too long. And maybe, just maybe, the earth has always been speaking to us in its own ancient language. Not with noise, but with patterns. With gifts left at doorsteps, with warmth carried in stones, with footsteps that never trample, only pass through. And the ones who understand that language, they're not chosen. They're simply the ones who chose to listen. In the end, these aren't just stories about forests or creatures or strange signs etched into bark. They're stories about us, about the parts of ourselves we bury and the parts we find again when we step off the beaten path, about what it means to be good when no one's keeping score, about what it means to belong, not by force, but by grace. If this story found you, if it stirred something quiet inside you, maybe that's no accident. Maybe it's your turn now to notice more, to give without asking, to believe just a little in things you can't quite explain. Thank you for walking with us this far, through every shadow and still breath. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to hear it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us what moved you most. And if you want to stay close to stories like this, rooted in compassion, wonder, and the wild places that still wait for us, make sure to follow and subscribe. The forest is still listening, and maybe so are you.